If you sometimes find yourself a little confused when dealing with Microsoft Identity or Azure AD, you're probably not alone. But the good news is, things are always improving, especially if you're an Asp.Net Core developer.
Let's muscle this.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Asp.Net Monsters. In today's episode, we are joined by a special guest. It is Christos Matskas. Hopefully, I'm saying that correctly. You're not leaving the room in anger, so it can't be too far off. He's a developer advocate on the Microsoft Identity team, and he is going to walk us through identity. And I'm hoping that at some point I can say to him, "Why the hell is this so hard? Why are there so many keys?" Why are there so many keys?
Or how about can I actually do that in one line?
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah. Right. How is it so easy? And I didn't know about it.
that'd be a great turning point in the conversation. Let's go there.
Yeah. We can start from that. You know, identity is definitely not a sexy subject. Identity is definitely not one of these things that we walk into the room and everybody's like, yes, let's talk about identity. It's going to be so exciting. But at the same time, we try to make it as exciting as it can be. My goal as a developer advocate is to obviously talk about identity to developers and then listen to their pain points and take that back into the product team so we can improve the experience. And
I think one of the, like, just right on that right away, like, I think one of the hardest things about it for most developers is that there's very, very few times in a project lifecycle when you're actually talking about identity. It's, you know, we're going to start a project, we're going to work on it for 3 years, and we're going to spend the first week and a half doing identity. And then at some point, 2 years, 3 years down the road, we're going to have to change identity systems, or we're doing a rebuild or something, or we're starting another app. And then when you go back to the identity landscape, it's an entirely different beast than it was.
Yes, you're absolutely right.
That's kind of how we got connected initially, isn't it? I was complaining on Twitter because I was going through exactly that process of trying to set this up again for a new project, and it had changed. I was like, oh, why is this so hard? And then you replied.
And then you came on the stream, and we suffered on the stream together by trying to wire it up. So you're absolutely right. Identity is one of the 150 things that you have to do in a project. There's no identity developers. It's funny because in our division, we always had this conversation like, who are the identity developers? I'm like, you guys that are building the product are the identity developers. Everybody else is a consumer that spends ideally 10 minutes integrating identity, and then they move on to the next task. Nobody wants to spend 3 months learning identity, and they shouldn't. It is definitely complex. We have OpenID Connect and OAuth 2 and all these standards and protocols. And as soon as you throw these names around, people are like, oh man, like flows and tokens and everything. I was watching a friend of our identity, as we call them, a fellow streamer, spending 4 hours trying to set up identity. And for them, it was the first time coming across all these different terms, you know, a token, a tenant, flows and authentication and redirect URIs and what have you. It's a lot for day zero to come across if it's your first time and be flooded by terminology, esoteric terms as well. Quite a few things are esoteric, just Microsoft stuff, right? Which are not consistent.
The other thing that's kind of at odds with how a lot of this stuff has progressed is that when you look at something like, cloud integration with services that are out there or whatever, it used to be that there was XML config and there was spin up time and there's complex scripts and you had to know all these things, but those things have become a right click add service, or you download a project template and it works. But identity doesn't feel like it's got there. Like I've got an API, a web API backend. I'm connecting to some Azure services. I need to invoke some functions. I need to store some stuff in queues. And as soon as I introduce identity into the concept, it's like there's work to do.
Yeah.
The concept count is really high. Like you're saying, there's all these terms, and if you've never seen them before, it can be pretty overwhelming.
It just feels like there's like a million ways to do it, and everybody has a slightly different approach to it. And it'll be like, well, you know, for this company, we're going to set up the same identity that we set up for this other company, but now we need to integrate with their Active Directory, which is using some sort of a backend that they cobble together. out of a bunch of machines that they pulled off the production floor back in 1987. And like, it'll just be ridiculous things.
Samuel and Kerberos. Yes.
Yeah, and then you'll get to a place where you're like, okay, I've got identity set up, and then you talk to the security team, and they just throw like some completely random wrench in the works, like, all of your passwords need to be in Swedish. And then we're like, wow, okay, how are we going to get around this?
I don't think I've come across the Swedish-only password, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's some odd requirement in some company. You're right. Like, we have a lot of terminology out there, but what we're aiming to do is to get you off the ground as quickly as possible, at least with where we're going with Microsoft Identity, is to get you off the ground as quickly as possible without you having to spend 3 months or 3 weeks learning the internals of OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect. Like, you need two things. One is to sign in users so you know who they are, and the second one is to grab an access token so you can what they can do, right? These are the two things predominantly that you care about identity. Who are you when you come to my application so I can customize the app, and what can you do by acquiring an access token? So 2 tokens, an ID token and an access token. And in some cases, I don't even want to talk about tokens to developers. I just want to say you need to sign in the user, and then you need to authorize them to go and access a service. And you're right, there are so many different ways to do that. Things have moved on significantly. Asp.Net has suffered from indecision as well. So we had the Asp.Net identity system, which up until very recently, that was the default for any file new project, add identity. So, you go into Visual Studio, you say file new project, I want to add identity, you check the box, and then lo and behold, you get some Azure AD settings and things are working outside the box, right? But suddenly you say, I want to go and access my database now. Or you need to get a token for accessing other internal services. Or you don't have MSAL. You need to go and download MSAL, and then you have to wire it up and make it work. And MSAL, by the way, for those that don't know, is the Microsoft Authentication library. And as a developer, you're now confused because, like, I have already signed in my user. Why do I need another library to go and do that? So that was very, very, very consistent. That's the thing that we heard. So we built a new library called the Microsoft Identity.web library for Asp.Net, which is the default experience now. So when you do file new project as of .NET Core 3.1 and later, that adds that for you. So authentication and authorization are handled by the same library. You don't have to download different libraries, and you wire it all up in the startup.cs. And technically, it takes a single line of code to do authentication, and it takes 3 lines of code to acquire tokens for other APIs. And this is brilliant because now you don't have to worry about, where is OAuth coming in and where is OpenID Connect and when do I need to use what and what flow am I following and is it working correctly? In saying that, though, as a library, it's fantastic for day 0 scenarios. It's a little bit harder when you go to day 30, where you have to now do a little bit more advanced things. Like, I want to enrich my JWT tokens to get more information out of that or add more information to my things. Luckily, MSAL library is still there, and these Microsoft Identity.web is built on top of MSAL. So you can interconnect and bring the other individual NuGet packages that allowed you to work with OpenID Connect. But this is an advanced scenario that we don't expect most people to go to for certain things. So
would you say then that Microsoft Identity Web it's an abstraction on top of MSAL?
Yes, it is. Yeah. It's exactly that. But it also builds on the V2 endpoints. So, you can do incremental consent and you get all the nice benefits of the V2 endpoints that we have in Microsoft Identity, which was not the case before. Yet another confusion that we're adding there. So if you are greenfield, if you're starting today, file new project with authentication will give you everything you need out of the box. And I just wrapped up a stream on the 45, so where I took a local identity provider, I wiped it out, and I added Microsoft Identity.web on an existing web app, so a brownfield project, which in effect was removing a bunch of code and views and stuff, and then adding a few lines of code to do it. Yes.
How many lines of configuration, though?
5.
Okay. That's not too bad.
And of course, using authorization code with Pixie, which is the latest supported one. In the past, we had to default to implicit flows, and sorry for talking about flows, because I know that these things may sound weird to some people or very new to that, but let's say implicit flow was the old way of the insecure way of acquiring tokens for your app, whereas now with authorization code and Pixie, PKCE, not PIXIE, because when I joined the company or the team back in 2019, it was 2020, it was 2020. Pixie was a very new thing that we just added support for, and everybody was going Pixie, and I could see chat and everything else, and I was like, I was looking for PIXIE on Twitter, on Google. I was trying to find what that is, and people were like, no, it's PKCE. So a proof key for code exchange. In effect, it's a framework for exchanging codes without touching the user's browser. So you're not compromising the security of the system. That's what it is. And we got support for those across the board.
So that's an area that I've struggled with a lot in the past when I do go to set up identity on a project with Microsoft Identity specifically. Is there's a lot of history there in terms of the different iterations of the services and the libraries. How do I know I'm looking at the right ones when I'm trying to get started, especially on a new project?
So the nice thing is that we try to keep all our samples up to date. So if you ever land on GitHub by searching for, say, Microsoft Identity, say React or Angular or whatever, they will pop up. The latest samples will include the right format. Also in our docs now, we have a full SDKs library document that says which version supports what, so you can make an informed decision. So for React, we have React v2.0, which is supporting authorization code. Then we also say which ones can acquire tokens for ID and which ones can get you access tokens. So the full compatibility is there. That hopefully gives you some guidance on how to get started. If you are an ASP.NET developer, Visual Studio will handhold you all the way, and we're adding some fantastic tooling in the upcoming versions. So not only will it configure the code for you, not only will it do the code gen, but it will also go and configure your Azure AD registration. So you don't have to leave the IDE. It will do everything end to end. And then at the end of the file new project experience, you press F5, and now you can sign in without you having to leave the IDE. Because up until this point, we took you all the way to the well, but we didn't give you water. Now we'll give you the water as well, right?
So it sounds like there's a lot of effort going into like the ASP.NET story. Are there other platforms you're putting a lot of effort into too? So I'm thinking specifically in my mind, like Azure Functions, mobile applications, anything in that space?
Yeah, so for mobile apps now we support authorization code with Pixie as well. So latest framework rather than implicit. It also we're continuously working on new languages and frameworks. With the team now, we're working on Maui. So the next version of Xamarin Forms, where you will be able to use Maui to create cross-platform applications that run desktop and mobile. So we're working with that team to improve the experience. We're working with languages outside the Microsoft ecosystem: Java, Go, Python, the native iOS libraries and the native Java libraries with Kotlin as well. So we want to make sure that no matter the framework that you come from, you'll have as consistent an experience as possible. It's not as good as the ASP.NET story, I'll tell you that. So we haven't got to the one-liner, add Microsoft Web App Authentication or add Microsoft Web API Authentication, but it is getting there. The latest Microsoft Identity.web library also added support natively for Azure Functions. So there is now a template for spinning up a .NET Azure function locally, like func init and func new, although you have to go through the .NET tooling. So .NET new func will allow you to spin up a new Azure function with the Microsoft Authentication components built into that.
Amazing.
Yes.
So I can tell you that maybe like 2.5 years ago, I spent, and I kid you not, a month getting that working. And I have described it as the single most frustrating thing I have ever done in my life.
It was one of the worst months of my life too, because we were hearing Simon like almost every day talking about it. So.
Yeah, it was rough on James.
It was really hard on everyone.
Yeah, I am not blaming you. And it's definitely a challenge for even for us. Like every day that we have to go and test these libraries and build stuff on the stream or build stuff, proof of concepts for you customers or developers, we always come across some small nuances that we need to go and figure with the team. It's a very large surface area. These libraries try to abstract a lot of things from you, right? They try to abstract all the flows, and then they also do all the caching for you, so you don't have to go back to the identity provider every single time to go and acquire tokens. They handle the offline refresh tokens as well for you. So if you didn't use these libraries, for example, you have to wire everything from scratch yourself, and it's not an easy task, trust me. And in some cases, when you don't want to use the MSAL library, because you might say, well, I wrote my app in Node and it's been using password for the last 4 years. I don't want to rip it apart and put MSAL there. Then there are some things that not every library will do consistently, like I said, caching, right? Mm-hmm. So I feel your pain. It's definitely something that we take into consideration every time we speak to developers out there.
That's great. And obviously you're better than those chumps over at Cognito anyway, so everything you can do.
I'm not going to bad mouth anyone out there, but
that's all right. Bad mouthing AWS is like my forte.
But it's another service that we support, right? So we don't really care where you run. I mean, as Microsoft Identity dev advocates, we do a lot of things that are not mainstream for Microsoft. Like we saw how you can run your apps on AWS authenticating against Azure AD, or running on other services like Google Cloud, or on premises, or your own Kubernetes cluster somewhere in your Raspberry Pis, all authenticated with Microsoft Identity. So as long as you do that, like in reality, I would love for everyone to use Azure AD, but there are other providers out there. So before the show, we talked about Federated Identity, right? We hear on the news every single day that yet another company has fallen victim to some cyber attack. They've fallen victim to some bad data management. So as long as you use some Federated Identity, I don't care, because that's the solution you should be using and looking at. But if you are going to use one, you might as well use Microsoft Identity.
So the story, like, I mean, even prior to the availability of like cloud-based identity providers and stuff like that, yeah. the one thing that was really compelling from, like, for example, in an MVC project was that it's file new project, identities included, and things were just done. Like yes. You just had for free all of the problems like SMS verification, email verification, password reset. Those were free as part of the template. So in taking this to the next, like to this next phase then of the new libraries that you guys have been working on, are those things incorporated, or are those flows effectively, those, like the password reset flow, that's, I guess, handed off to the identity services proper then, not part of your application?
Yes, and by the way, if I remember correctly, when you were using the Asp.Net identity system, you still had to wire up the email and
you had to register accounts for those and put in your
keys. So you have to use external services, right? So straight away you rely on some other service to do that for you. It was fantastic because, as you say, it was easy. Everything was there. But suddenly, let's say you work for a large organization. I work for banks, for example, where they had hundreds, if not thousands, of different systems where they had to manage users. And going by that model, it means they have disparate databases all over your organization. Some of them internally accessible, some of them externally accessible. And guess what? Many of them did not manage their users correctly. So I had people leaving companies and then being still able to access all their company systems 2 years after they left with full admin permissions, because there's no centralized way to manage databases.
And then you get into like these hybrid solutions where you're like plugging in identity server, and then you're like reading, okay, what kind of credential was provided, and which store do I go to try and generate or to get authentication off this user. And so I've done that before, where I've got like 3 or 4 user stores in the background, and I'm having to decide, oh, well, they provided me an email address, so I'm going to go over to that database to authorize them. And so you end up with those hybrid crazy solutions, right? So
yes. And as the organization grows, then these challenges grow as well. Like you might go from that company and then somebody else takes over and then they have to learn everything from scratch. And going back to the initial question, like, do I get MFA? Do I get, the advanced features that I would expect from an identity system? Absolutely. And you get them for free. You don't have to code a single line of code, right? You say, if your IT admin for your Active Directory has said everybody has to use MFA, then you as a developer don't have to do anything. It trickles down through the library and then it manages everything for you. And then there's conditional access. We're working on, for example, something that it is going to be fantastic when it gets ratified as a standard, continuous access evaluation. Think about that. You issue somebody an access token to go and access your database, but suddenly they get fired, or suddenly something happens that they should not have access to that database system anymore. Now, for 1 hour or for 55 hours, no matter how big or how long the token life cycle is, that token will be valid, right? They still have that access token on their machine. They can still access your database no matter what you do, even if you remove them from your Azure AD tenant, because they have already authorized access. Continuous access evaluation will allow a system to continuously assess the token and say, well, you know what? In this scenario, I think you need to re-authenticate. At which point, if you're not part of that tenant, if you're not part of that role, then you shouldn't have access to these things. Now think about it. You don't have to worry about token lifecycles anymore. It's handled by the system for you. Try to code that yourself. That's insane, right?
Thanks.
Yeah, exactly. Obviously, this is not ratified. This is not a standard yet, but Microsoft is working on a first kind of implementation. It's very proprietary for now until we work with the wider organization to ratify the whole thing. But as the next step into security, that's brilliant.
So those kinds of things are still going to help us take care of the scenario where we're doing a lot of the server side processing and logic and things like that. What about when we shift over to the applications that are either view based or React or whatever, and we need the token, like that process where we're negotiating tokens and authentication is happening up at JavaScript on the client rather than C# level down or Node or whatever down on the server?
The MSAL library will still work in the exact same way. So if you have configured your Azure app registration, so your Active Directory app registration to use a single page app for authentication, which is part of the configuration, and you're using the appropriate libraries, then that lifecycle, those permissions will always trickle down to that library. So you won't be able to access, for example, if conditional access says nobody can access the app after 5 p.m. or nobody in the US can access the app due to data sovereignty issues, right? Then conditional access will allow you to implement that at the admin level, and the developers don't have to worry about coding that business logic into the app themselves, no matter the front end or the back end or the system.
Right. Okay. So, and that is good. I think that like we're asking hard questions. So
no, it's fine. Go for it.
But one of the challenges becomes, okay, now I've got an authenticated client in JavaScript.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to get a token. I'm going to have to go and set something up with the router and come up with interceptors and all that stuff. Are there any moves to push this, like to have available libraries that allow us to just, here's the plugin for Vue or here's the plugin for React that allows you to wire these things up and take care of the things like the handoff to login and token generation and whatnot?
This is a great question. I think David came across this challenge when we're doing our Vue example, right? Because we don't have a component for Vue yet. We don't have an MSAL component for Vue yet. So you have to create some kind of a singleton that acts at the application level, so you don't instantiate your MSAL every single time. And it handles the token generation and token acquisition at the application level. However, for React and Angular, we have Angular components and React components. So we have a React MSAL and an Angular MSAL, which are designed for these frameworks. Outside of those two, I get it that we have a gap, and it's demand driven. So if you feel that there is a big gap for Vue, and we have lots of Vue people that say, you know what, we definitely demand a Vue component for MSAL, then we can take that back into our product team and prioritize that.
Do we have the power on this call to make that demand?
Raise a GitHub issue.
On on it?
Absolutely. I mean, this is the whole point. Everything is being developed in the open. So all these libraries are publicly available on GitHub. So you can go and see how they've been written, what's the next iteration. For example, the Node.js MSAL library it was in private preview, but it was available on GitHub. So you can go and test it out and play around. And I was doing a session the other day. I said, well, the Node.js MSAL library does not support APIs yet. And I took people to the repo, and then I suddenly saw that it was supporting APIs. So between the 2 weeks that I had a look into the library, things have moved on significantly.
So
And
there is
the
active
same,
development there, and there is going to, yeah, okay, that's
yes. And it is it's a debate, right? Because we've been hearing a lot of discussions about, do we want to provide a proxy service for authentication, or do we want to make it available to developers in the box? Things like EasyAuth, for example, make it super easy to switch on authentication. And we're now looking at, is this the way that we want to take the Microsoft Identity platform? Like, do we want to also provide you an out-of-the-box experience like Azure AD App Proxy, something that sits in front of your application that does the authentication for you, and then your authentication is oblivious to what authentication settings are happening or how it works. But I think this is something that we need to look into further, because it is my opinion that developers like to use SDKs and they want to have control of how things are happening and why they're happening in their machine, in their app. So it's all these different contradicting requirements and projects and ideas that we're investigating all the time.
Yeah, it's certainly a challenge trying to cater to that wide of an audience. One of the challenges I see with like the JavaScript front end libraries, especially, maybe less so with Angular, because Angular is like a full framework where you kind of have a predefined way that you structure the applications. But when you get into the React or the Vue worlds, how are you doing routing within your application? It's different for everybody. And so it becomes kind of a challenge to build like a single library that you can pull in that just makes the Microsoft Identity stuff work. So that's kind of been my challenge on those particular frameworks, but
it is like and I had this conversation the other day for the Java library, right? The MSAL4J. We're looking to integrate more tooling into IntelliJ to make it actually available to Java developers to be able to go file a new project, add authentication, will do it for you via the Azure toolkit for IntelliJ. And the debate that we had there is like, which framework do we target? Spring Boot is the most prominent framework on Java, but then there are other 100 different frameworks to allow you to do web development. So how can we help all the developers out there to do the right thing? It is, I mean, in Asp.Net, we're very opinionated. Like there are very few basic templates that you use for building web apps. You use web app with MVC, you can do Razor pages, and you gRPC, APIs, and that's it, like 5 different ways. So for those 5 different ways, we can be opinionated where your identity should go. But with JavaScript, like I can write a JavaScript that uses Node just to spin up a page, and then everything else is handled by either framework or bespoke solution by me. So how do I cater for those developers? It's a challenge. So I totally get it.
Yeah, it definitely is. So how big is the team that develops this stuff? This is a question that I always ask people, because I know that there are some teams out there that were like, oh, that's such a productive team. Then it turns out to be like 3 guys sitting in a back room somewhere, and they just don't let them out.
Or you get,
and then other times it's like 200 people. And I'm like, what? There's 200 people on the functions team? That's crazy. How have I only met 2 of them?
Or you run into cases where it's like somebody says, oh, no, we don't need to use an external authentication thing. I can write that myself. And you're kind of like, can you?
Hey, I wrote mine back in 2007. I wrote my own CMS because I can do it so much better, obviously. And I even wrote my own authentication system where I would like, hey, I have my username and password. How it works. I am hashing, so I was doing it properly. I was not encrypting my passwords. Like I did my research. Like, how do I hash properly? Oh, Bcrypt. Okay, I'm gonna use Bcrypt, and then you play with Bcrypt, and you can see like you can hammer your PC if you change the the settings to go from 10 cycles to 15 cycles. So that was fun. So you find the right balance. And I was like, oh, but then somebody can brute force attack my system. So you read about brute force attacks on sign in, and you have to learn about these nuances, right? You fix that. And then the next one is, how do I protect against 2-factor authentication interception? Like, what happens if a man in the middle attack takes place? So there are all these different components.
It's at least overall, At least
at least 8 hours worth of full effort. I would say we have a fantastic slide somewhere that we don't really show outside. I mean, it's a public thing, so we've done it before. We've shown it before. That shows all the different components of the Azure Active Directory. Like how many different things are in place to allow you to scale from 1 to 30 billion authentications a day without flinching. We do 30 billion authentications per day on that platform. It's just insane. It's a lot of telemetry. So to answer your question, there are about 2,500 people working, PMs, engineering, and IT across the division. There are smaller teams that focus on SDKs and what have you, but I think the engineering team is about 1,600 people. So there are 1,600 identity developers out there that do all the hard work, so you don't have to.
All right, I'm going to take that quote back to my engineering manager, who just recently said, maybe we should consider writing our own authentication system. And I'm going to be like, sure, I need a $10 million budget to do this.
Yeah, it's like if your engineering manager wants to have a chat with us to explain why this shouldn't be, then we're more than happy to discuss that. And then
I feel like that sentence alone is going to be enough to convince him a little bit.
Christos said that it takes 1,600 engineers to work day in, day out to keep the identity system working. And there's this other component of identity that we haven't really touched upon today, but it is also a parallel thing. CI/CD, secure DevOps, secure ops, and then things like managed identities, which are all run by Microsoft Identity, but it's behind the scenes. So you don't directly interact with Microsoft Identity. You say, you know what, I want my web app to access my SQL server without passing any credentials. And this is probably more exciting than authentication authorization. I love talking about this thing because can you imagine not having to ever know any secret to your production systems or any other systems? You just write the code and it just runs. Right, it runs from developer QA to production without changing a single line of code.
Yeah, it's exciting, like kind of all the stuff that comes together. Nick, I was doing some work yesterday setting up disk encryption on virtual machines, and that integrates with Key Vault, and you like set up a bunch of stuff in there and it just magically encrypts it. And the guy I was working on it with was like, oh, do we need to add ourselves to this Key Vault? And I was like, well, we should. Wait a second. Maybe we don't need to add ourselves. Like if just these systems can talk to Key Vault and rotate their keys and just set up their encryption, like if I don't have access to Key Vault, then I can't screw it up.
Correct.
So you're taking me out of the loop, and I am in like 90% of failure cases the root cause of the failure. So getting rid of me reduces our number of failures by like an order of magnitude.
That's right. And it's not more of a single point of failure, it's the attack vector. You'll notice that cyber attacks lately have become a lot more intelligent. So they won't try to go for a 0 day on the operating system or a 0 day on your browser. They won't look for security gaps in Azure, right? What they will do is attack the human element, because humans are a lot more gullible in either passing information or not protecting themselves adequately enough. Like we still get phishing attacks. Even on our tenant, we just get tested every single time by getting these random emails. So it's much easier for me to compromise your machine via some kind of a phishing attack or some social engineering. And then with your permissions, and trust me, most of the developers have admin rights to their tenants. Most of them are contributors, right? What are you guys, for example? I will ask you. How many of you are non-contributors to their Azure tenants?
I have a scary level of access to probably like 10 different Azure subscriptions.
Exactly. So if I am able to compromise your permissions and I can hack around your machine to find some credentials that you put somewhere in some file or environmental, settings, environmental properties, or even the secrets, in the .NET secrets file, like, hey, I'm protecting them. They're not in my code, but they're still in your local machine, all clear text, right? So think about that. Eliminating all the secrets and the element of compromise by taking that away using Key Vault and Azure AD just becomes awesome. Like I just wrapped up a stream this morning where we're using SQL client with Azure Identity. So we're using the Azure Identity Library to authenticate against SQL Azure from my local machine without passing any credentials, with maybe 10 lines of code. I don't have to know the secrets. My admin knows the secrets. Key Vault is fully accountable, so they can see where the sign-ins are coming from, how they're implemented. Like if we get a sign-in from, I don't know, Europe, then there's a red herring there. Like I don't know why that authentication effort is coming into Key Vault. So all these allow you to have full control of who and when they can access the system, and auditing.
It's true. Right? They barely have computers at all in Europe, so something fishy is going on for sure over there.
True. We shouldn't care about them. They still have these like wooden tablets that they scribble. We just alienated just half of the earth, but it's fine.
So what's going to be like the big cool thing in the future? You mentioned the kind of token revocation stuff that's coming. What else is cool and coming down the line in identity land?
I think continuous access evaluation will probably be one of the biggest features that I'm excited about. We continuously work on improving our APIs and our experience for both consumer authentication. We didn't talk about Azure AD B2C, for example, which gives you the ability to authenticate external users to your org, right? Like you have a customer-facing app. You're the next Walmart. You're the next Tesco. You're the next big, platform, right? You want to be able to authenticate users at scale. So that's the other element of authentication we didn't talk about. And having the ability to switch from one endpoint to another endpoint and say, I'm going from internal users to external users, and doing very few lines of code to change that. It's just impressive, right? In fact, with Microsoft Identity Web, you just have to change the endpoint that you're calling, and it works automatically. So you go from internal authentication to external authentication, which is great. So what else? I mean, we are working on taking the Microsoft Identity Web model, the one-liner that sets everything up for you, to other languages as well. So if you find that exciting and you're like, man, I want everything to be abstracted from me because I don't want to care, I don't want to know what happens behind the scenes, then please do provide feedback. Every time we present that to user groups and conferences, people just go, damn, that's one line of code to get everything done. That's just magic. And I love it. So yeah, we're open to feedback. We have a fantastic Discord community, so people can come and talk about identity and any problems that they have with Azure. So that's definitely growing. We stream every 3 days a week now. We have IT, and then we do developer stuff on Twitch every Tuesday and Friday, just showing real end-to-end scenarios, right? Because most of the time, as you know, the docs are doing a fantastic job showing you the one bit, and then you don't know what the next bit is going to be. So like David came on the stream and we did an Azure Functions backend with Vue.js front end, and we're able to hook everything up eventually together. We found that small little thing that just couldn't work, and then we ran out of time. But it's one of these things that you come across and you have to fix. But end-to-end scenarios are very important today. It's not just, hey, how do I get my users through the door? But what do I do with my users once they go through the door? I need to access Graph. I need to access storage. I need to access my Cosmos DB. All these exciting things. And convergence. I think that in the future, especially if you're on the Microsoft platform, you'll see this kind of an end-to-end experience, which is very unique. Unlike anyone else, unlike AWS or Google Cloud or any other provider out there, we're the only ones that really, truly care about developers, right? We give you Visual Studio Code, and we take that experience from developer all the way to production in a very consistent manner. Like, I'm not saying that your code is not going to run on AWS, but imagine Key Vault is not going to be there. Secretless apps are not going to be there. So and Microsoft ecosystem, you get so much more, but we still support everybody else. We love any language and any platform.
Yeah, I feel like AWS might actually actively hate developers based on some of the decisions that they make.
But they have great SDKs, right? I'm gonna give them that, right? Their SDKs is spot on.
Yeah, and the 4 lines of documentation they have on their SDKs are equally good.
I see some deep pain there.
I may have worked a little bit too long with AWS on my current project.
Before we let you go, we just want to let you know we are a little bit worried about you, and I don't know if you're sensitive to the robot uprising or anything, but there is a robot that has been making several passes in the background, and we just want you to be aware of that. It's going back and forth very low across the floor. It may be plotting some devious thing. We just wanted you to be aware.
We haven't attached knives to our Roomba yet. That's the next step. It's good though. I mean, I'm quite impressed by how well it scans the floor and avoids obstacles. Although the other day it got stuck and I got a message saying I found uneven ground. I'm like, you can't unless you try to go up the steps, which is the robot uprising. I can't understand why you found an obstacle on the ground on a flat floor. Apparently tried to climb one of the floor lights that had some kind of a ramp that you could go up. But hey.
I think, like, I know you do your live stream with your other with the other like on Twitch and stuff like that several times a week. So we will definitely include in the show notes we can't do a raid like live on Twitch like a lot of people do or whatever, but we will definitely put some notes in the show notes or whatever. But if you're open to it, I think it'd be a lot of fun to have you here and walk through one of those end-to-end scenarios. It maybe doesn't have to, maybe it can be something pre-scripted. That's okay. We do that all the time, so we don't have to take too many detours on you and throw some curveballs or whatever. But we'll probably do that too, just because obviously you're not, this isn't brought to the viewers by the Microsoft Identity Platform or anything. Although we always leave it open to that. I mean, if you
you're looking for sponsorship. I see what you did there. Like, so subtle. I like it. I will give you another slot if you sponsor it. How about
that? It's a 3-year
contract. I'm paying to be a guest. I see. I'm just kidding.
No, but we'd love to have you back on and talk about some of those things. And so yeah, that's been great. Just hearing some about this. And actually, do you know what? To be honest, knowing that there's like 1,600 engineers on our side, like that's good stuff. That's good stuff.
Reassuring. Absolutely. Yes. Cool. Well, thank you for having me. I'm definitely up for some demos and showing these things in action and how they're put together. We can come up with a nice scenario. Maybe we can show the latest stuff on Cosmos DB, so we can have an Asp.Net web app authenticating against Azure AD and then getting some data from Cosmos, because we just added support for Azure AD authentication, which means that now you don't have to use keys anymore. Again, you use the Azure Identity Library to go and call into Cosmos, which is freaking awesome. And that's a good scenario that we haven't talked about. So maybe that we can do that next time.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
Awesome.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us on today's episode, and for everybody out there in Cyberland watching this episode. We appreciate you coming, and we really appreciate you finding the key to happiness, which, as we all know, is clicking like, comment, and share. And we'll see everybody on the next episode.
Cheers.
Bye. Bye.